The Unseen. Chapter 1. The old Buick rumbled to a stop at the rusted gates of Blackwood Asylum, kicking up a cloud of dust that hung heavy in the stale summer air. Mia Walker peered up at the decrepit brick facade through the bug-splattered windshield, a chill running down her spine despite the oppressive August heat. "You sure this is a good idea?" asked Olivia from the back seat, her voice barely a whisper. Ethan, sitting shotgun, twisted around to fix her with a smirk. "What's the matter, Liv? Scared of a few ghosts?" "No," Olivia huffed. "It's just, I don't know. Something about this place feels wrong." "Well, no shit," said Josh. "That's kind of the whole point. Abandoned nut house, creepy vibes. It's like Horror 101. He reached over to give Olivia a playful punch on the arm, but she shrank back, her eyes never leaving the asylum. Beside her, Liam just shook his head, the hint of a scowl flickering across his angular face. Mia cut the ignition, and the engine sputtered into silence. For a few long moments, no one moved. They just sat there, staring up at the hulking ruin that loomed over them like a slumbering beast. The asylum had been abandoned for decades, ever since the scandal broke about the horrific experiments conducted within its moldering walls. Unethical procedures, barbaric treatments. It was like something out of a grindhouse film. The public outrage had been swift and fierce. The asylum was shut down practically overnight, its former staff melting away into the shadows. But the stories persisted. Whispers of strange phenomena, ghostly apparitions stalking the halls. A darkness that lingered, patient and hungry. Most folks gave Blackwood a wide berth these days. But for a certain subset, the old asylum held an irresistible allure. Thrill seekers, paranormal enthusiasts, the morbidly curious, and apparently bored college kids. "Okay," said Mia, shattering the heavy silence. "Let's do this." As if on cue, they piled out of the car, gathering their gear from the trunk. Flashlights, snacks, Ethan's fancy camera for his YouTube channel. It felt a little silly in the light of day, like they were trick-or-treaters suiting up for Halloween. But as they approached the rusted gates, an icy finger of dread traced its way down Mia's back. The padlock was laughably easy to break, the gates shrieking on their ancient hinges as they swung open. Mia took a deep breath of the thick, stagnant air. No turning back now. Together, the five of them crossed the weed-choked threshold into the asylum grounds. If they had known then what horrors awaited them inside, they would have turned tail and fled, burning rubber all the way back to the safe tedium of campus life. But the hungry darkness of Blackwood Asylum already had them in its cold, dead grasp, and it had no intention of letting them go. Chapter 2. The main entrance of Blackwood Asylum gaped before them like the mouth of an enormous beast, the heavy oak doors eaten away by decades of rot. Josh shouldered through first, sending up a cloud of dust and dead leaves. The others filed in after him, blinking against the sudden gloom. The entryway was cavernous, the cracked tile floor stretching away into shadow. A grand staircase swept up to the second floor, its once polished banister now thick with grime. The air hung heavy with must and decay, underlaid by a faint, sickly sweet odor that made Mia's gorge rise. "Charming," said Ethan, nose wrinkling. He swept his flashlight beam across the room, picking out details. A moldering portrait, a rusted wheelchair overturned in the corner. "Okay, farm boy, let's get that camera rolling," said Josh, unslinging his backpack. "I want to do an intro shot in front of that creepy-ass painting." As the boys set up the camera equipment, Mia drifted away, drawn by some indefinable pull. Olivia trailed after her, sticking close like a nervous shadow. They picked their way down a debris-strewn hallway, flashlight beams strobing across peeling wallpaper and rotted drywall. Mia couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The blackened eye sockets of the doors seemed to follow her movement, their silence heavy with secrets. She shivered despite the close, muggy air. "Look!" Olivia's whisper shattered the sepulchral hush. She was pointing her light at a battered door, the wood scarred with jagged gouges that looked suspiciously like claw marks. A rusted metal plate was bolted to the door at eye level, the engraved letters still legible beneath decades of grime. Patient records. Mia tried the handle, not really expecting it to turn, but the door swung open with a keening groan, revealing a small room lined with ancient filing cabinets. Mia stepped inside, pulse quickening with a kind of morbid anticipation. Olivia hung back at the threshold, worrying her lower lip between her teeth. The nearest cabinet was unlocked, the drawer squealing as Mia tugged it open. She pulled out a handful of manila folders, each one brittle with age. The typewritten labels faded to near illegibility. She flipped one open at random and began to read. "Oh my God." The words slipped out unbidden, a breathless exclamation of horror. Olivia edged closer, craning to see over Mia's shoulder. The file detailed the case of one Malcolm Grimes, a patient committed to Blackwood in the late 1950s. The intake notes painted a grim picture: auditory and visual hallucinations, violent outbursts, paranoid delusions. But it was the treatment logs that turned Mia's stomach. Electroshock therapy, 3 times a week. Insulin-induced comas, lobotomy. And at the bottom of each log entry, the same cryptic notation: progressing well, corruption level 7. Mia shuffled through the other files, a growing sense of dread knotting her gut. The details varied, but the broad strokes were the same. Senseless brutality masquerading as medicine, and always that same chilling phrase: corruption level. What the hell were they doing to these people? Olivia breathed. Before Mia could hazard a guess, a sudden crash echoed from somewhere deep within the asylum, followed by a blood-curdling scream. Olivia yelped, colliding with Mia in her haste to get out of the records room. Together they fled back down the hall, hearts pounding in tandem. They nearly bowled over the boys, who came pelting around the corner wild-eyed and ashen-faced. "What was that?" Mia demanded, fighting to keep the tremor from her voice. "I don't know," Ethan panted, "but it came from downstairs, the basement." As if in answer, another scream ripped through the stagnant air, raw and ragged and brimming with an almost inhuman agony. And beneath it, nearly drowned out by the echoes, a low, guttural sound that could only be one thing: laughter. Chapter 3. They stood frozen at the top of the basement stairs, paralyzed by the sounds of torment echoing up from the depths. Mia's mind reeled, trying to process the enormity of what they'd stumbled into. This was more than just a spooky old building. There was something profoundly wrong here, an evil that went beyond the garden-variety ghosts and goblins. "We need to get out of here," Olivia whimpered, her fingernails digging into Mia's arm. "Now!" Mia opened her mouth to agree, but Josh cut her off with a sharp gesture. "Wait," he hissed. "Listen." The screaming had stopped. The air hung dead and heavy, the silence almost worse than the sounds of agony. Mia strained her ears, heart thudding against her ribs. There, a soft rhythmic scuffling like footsteps shuffling through the dust, and it was getting closer. "Go," Ethan snapped, giving Mia a sharp shove between the shoulder blades. "Move!" They bolted, a panicked tangle of limbs careening through the darkened halls. Mia's lungs burned, fear clawing at her throat. She didn't dare look back, terrified of what she might see. A sudden cry pierced the air behind them, a wordless shriek of terror that could only be Liam. Mia skidded to a halt, whirling around just in time to see the darkness at the end of the hall coalesce into a writhing, shadowy mass. And in the center of that mass, barely visible in the guttering flashlight beams, was Liam. His mouth yawned in a silent scream, his eyes bulging with terror as the darkness engulfed him, tendrils of icy black curling around his thrashing limbs. "Liam!" Olivia's voice cracked on a sob, her hand flying to her mouth. Mia grabbed her arm, dragging her back as the others stumbled to a shell-shocked halt. "We can't help him," she panted, hating the words even as they left her mouth. "We have to go, now!" She didn't wait for a response, just took off running again, trusting the others to follow. They careened around a corner, flashlight beams strobing wildly across the crumbling walls. And then Mia's foot caught on something, a loose board or a chunk of rubble, and she went sprawling, the breath leaving her lungs in a painful whoosh. Stars exploded behind her eyes as her head cracked against the floor. Dimly, through the ringing in her ears, she heard the others shouting her name, their voices high and frightened. Hands grabbed at her, hauling her roughly to her feet. Mia blinked, trying to clear the fog from her vision. And then she saw it. Halfway down the hall, a figure stood motionless in the shadows. It was vaguely human-shaped, but there was something horribly wrong about its proportions. Its limbs too long and spindly, its head cocked at an impossible angle. As Mia watched in breathless horror, the figure stepped forward into the flashlight beam. And she saw its face. It was Liam. Or at least it had been Liam. His features were distorted, stretched taut over the bones of his skull like a grotesque mask. His eyes were gone, replaced by yawning black pits that seemed to pull at the light, drinking it in. His mouth split into a grin, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. And then he spoke, his voice a guttural rasp that echoed with all the horrors of the asylum's dark past. "You're next." Chapter 4. Mia didn't remember running, didn't remember the others dragging her along, their panicked breaths mingling with her own. All she could see was Liam's face, that horrible, twisted mockery of the boy she'd known. It wasn't until they burst through the front doors of the asylum, spilling out into the overgrown courtyard, that the fog of terror began to lift. Mia bent double, hands braced on her knees as she sucked in great shuddering lungfuls of air. "What the hell was that?" Josh panted, his voice raw with fear. "It got Liam," Olivia whimpered. "Oh God, it got Liam!" Ethan was frantically patting his pockets, his eyes wide and glassy with shock. "Where are the keys?" he demanded. "Who has the goddamn keys?" A jolt of pure icy dread speared through Mia's gut. The keys, they were in her backpack, which she'd left in the records room. I don't," she stammered, but Ethan was already shaking his head, a kind of desperate fury twisting his features. "You've got to be kidding me," he snarled. "You left them inside? With that thing?" "I'm sorry," Mia whispered, feeling the hot prickle of tears welling up behind her eyes. I wasn't thinking." "Clearly," Ethan snapped. "Hey," Josh interjected, stepping between them. "Take it easy, man. We're all freaked out here." Ethan opened his mouth to retort, but before he could get a word out, a blood-curdling scream ripped through the air. It was coming from inside the asylum. Olivia let out a choked sob, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. "Oh no," she whimpered. "No, no, no." "We have to go back in," Mia said, the words leaden on her tongue. "We can't leave Liam." Ethan rounded on her, his eyes wild. "Are you insane?" he hissed. "Did you not see what happened in there? That thing, whatever it is, it's got him. He's gone." "You don't know that," Mia shot back, a sudden reckless anger surging through her. "He could be hurt, he could be—" She trailed off, unable to bring herself to voice the alternative. An awful, suffocating silence descended, broken only by the distant shrieks echoing from the bowels of the asylum. "We can't just leave him," Josh said quietly. "Mia's right. We have to try." Ethan looked from one to the other, jaw clenched so hard Mia could see a vein jumping in his temple. For a moment she thought he might protest, might insist on finding another way out. But then his shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of him like water from a sieve. "Fine," he gritted out. "But we stick together, and if things go sideways, we get the hell out. No heroics." Mia nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Her heart was a wild thing in her chest, terror and determination warring for dominance. They turned to face the asylum, its darkened windows seeming to leer at them like the eyes of some malevolent beast. Mia took a deep, shaky breath, trying to steel herself for what lay ahead, and then, as one, they stepped forward into the hungry darkness. Chapter 5. The asylum was waiting for them. Mia could feel it the moment they crossed the threshold, a palpable sense of malevolence that pressed down on her like a physical weight. The air was thick and heavy, redolent with the stench of decay and something far worse, an acrid chemical smell that made her nostrils sting. They crept down the main hall, flashlight beams cutting swathes through the gloom. Mia tried to retrace their frantic flight, looking for anything that might point them towards Liam, but every mildewed corridor looked the same. It was as if the asylum itself was shifting around them, a labyrinth of shadow and rot. I don't like this, Olivia whispered, her voice small and frightened in the oppressive silence. It feels like it's watching us. Mia shuddered, the hairs on the back of her neck standing up in atavistic response. Olivia was right. There was a sense of awareness in the darkness, a malign intelligence that tracked their every move with avid, unseen eyes. There. Josh's harsh whisper shattered the stillness. He was pointing towards a gaping doorway at the end of the hall, his flashlight beam disappearing into the inky depths beyond. Mia's heart seized in her chest. She recognized that door. It led down to the basement, where the screams had come from. Ethan must have realized it too, because he shook his head vehemently, backing away a step. No way, he said, his voice tight with barely suppressed panic. We're not going down there. We have to, Mia said, though the words tasted like ash on her tongue. Liam! She broke off, unable to continue. The thought of what might be happening to Liam, what horrors he might be enduring, made her gorge rise. Josh laid a hand on Ethan's shoulder, his face grim. She's right, man. We can't leave him. Not like this. Ethan looked from one to the other, his jaw working as he struggled with some internal battle. Mia could see the fear in his eyes, the desperate urge to flee warring with his loyalty to his friend. But in the end, there was only one choice. He gave a tight, jerky nod, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. Okay, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But we go slow. And if anything happens, if we see anything... He didn't finish, but he didn't need to. They all knew what he meant. If the thing that took Liam found them, there would be no mercy, no quarter given. They would run, and they wouldn't look back. Mia took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to calm the wild hammering of her heart. She could feel the weight of the others' gazes on her, looking to her for leadership, for strength. She squared her shoulders, forced herself to meet their eyes. Stay close, she said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. And whatever happens, we don't get separated. We stick together. One by one they nodded, a silent pact sealed in the darkness. Mia turned back to the yawning doorway, the flashlight heavy in her sweat-slicked palm. Step by step, they descended into the depths of the asylum, into the very heart of the darkness that waited hungrily below. Chapter 6. The stairs seemed to go on forever, a narrow, winding descent into the bowels of the earth. The air grew colder as they went deeper, a bone-deep chill that seeped through Mia's jacket and raised goosebumps on her skin. At the bottom, a long, low-ceilinged corridor stretched out before them, lined with rusted metal doors. Mia played her flashlight beam over the nearest one, her stomach clenching at the sight of the heavy padlock, the small barred window set at eye level. These weren't just rooms, they were cells. Cages for the asylum's most disturbed patients, the ones deemed too dangerous, too unpredictable for the regular wards. Jesus, Josh breathed, his face pale in the harsh white glare of the flashlights. What the hell were they doing down here? Mia shook her head, not wanting to contemplate the answer. She could all too easily imagine the kinds of horrors that might have played out in these dank, forgotten halls, the screams that must have echoed off the cold stone walls. They pressed on, picking their way carefully over the debris-strewn floor. Olivia stuck close to Mia's side, her fingers digging into Mia's arm hard enough to bruise. Mia couldn't blame her. The oppressive weight of the asylum's dark history seemed to press down on them from all sides, a suffocating pall of misery and despair. And then from somewhere up ahead came a sound, a soft rhythmic thumping, like the beat of some gigantic diseased heart. Mia froze, her own heart climbing into her throat. Ethan turned to look at her, his eyes wide with fear. "What is that?" he whispered. Mia shook her head, not daring to speak. The sound was getting louder, echoing off the close stone walls until it seemed to fill the entire corridor, vibrating in Mia's bones. Thump, thump, thump. And then, beneath the thumping, another sound. A wet, slithering noise, like something dragging itself across the damp stone floor. Something big. Olivia let out a whimper, her face draining of all color. Mia grabbed her hand, squeezing it hard, trying to convey some measure of reassurance she didn't feel. The thumping grew louder, the slithering closer. Mia's entire body was rigid with terror, every instinct screaming at her to run, to flee this cursed place and never look back. But she couldn't move, paralyzed by the awful knowledge of what was coming for them. And then it appeared, rounding the corner at the far end of the corridor. At first, Mia couldn't make sense of what she was seeing, her mind refusing to process the sheer wrongness of it. It was vaguely human-shaped, but grotesquely distorted, its limbs too long and spindly, its torso bloated and misshapen. Its skin was a sickly mottled gray, glistening with a layer of viscous slime. But it was the face that truly horrified Mia, sending a bolt of pure primal terror straight through her core. Because the face was Liam's, or rather it had been Liam's. Now it was a twisted, distorted parody of the boy she'd known, his features stretched and warped like melted wax. His eyes were gone, replaced by yawning, fathomless pits that seemed to drink in the light. And his mouth, dear God, his mouth. It split his face from ear to ear in a ghastly, shark-like grin, filled with row upon row of jagged, needle-sharp teeth. The thing that had been Liam opened that terrible maw and let out a sound that Mia knew would haunt her nightmares for the rest of her life. A high, keening wail, filled with an agony beyond comprehension, an anguish beyond the scope of human understanding. And beneath that wail, woven through it like a skein of rotten silk, the unmistakable sound of laughter. Chapter 7. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, they stood frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe, as the thing that had been Liam shambled towards them. It moved with a jerky, uncoordinated gait, as if it was still learning how to use its twisted limbs. And then Ethan screamed, a high, ragged sound of pure, unbridled terror, and the spell was broken. "Run!" Mia yelled, yanking Olivia forward. "Go, go, go!" They ran, stumbling and tripping over the uneven floor, their flashlight beams strobing wildly off the dank stone walls. Behind them, the thing let out another of those awful, keening wails, a sound of hunger and rage and inhuman malevolence. Mia risked a glance over her shoulder and immediately wished she hadn't. The thing was gaining on them, its elongated limbs pumping with a hideous, spasmodic grace. It was fast, far faster than any human could be. They careened around a corner, Mia's shoulder slamming painfully into the wall. Ahead, the corridor branched off in two directions, a T-junction of crumbling stone and rusted metal. "Which way?" Josh panted, his eyes wild with fear. Mia hesitated, her mind spinning. She had no idea where either path led, no way of knowing which might offer even a chance of escape. But they couldn't afford to slow down, not with that thing behind them. "Left," she gasped out, making the decision on pure instinct. "Go left." They plunged down the left-hand corridor, their footsteps echoing like gunshots in the close, fetid air. The thing behind them let out another wail, a sound of fury and frustration. It knew its prey was escaping. And then, just as Mia was beginning to think they might actually make it, might actually have a chance, Olivia stumbled. It was a small thing, a mere hiccup in her stride, but it was enough. She went down hard, her ankle twisting beneath her with a sickening pop. Her scream of pain and fear pierced Mia like a blade to the heart. "Olivia!" Mia skidded to a halt, turning back to where Olivia lay sprawled on the damp stone floor, her face contorted in agony. Josh and Ethan had stopped too, their chests heaving with exertion and fear. For a moment, the four of them stood frozen, the only sound the ragged sawing of their breath and the distant echoing wails of the thing that pursued them. And then Mia heard it. A soft, wet slithering, growing louder with every passing second. The thing had found them. "Get up," she hissed at Olivia, grabbing her arm and trying to haul her to her feet. "We have to move now!" But Olivia only shook her head, tears streaming down her ashen face. "I can't," she sobbed. "My ankle, I think it's broken." Mia's heart plummeted like a stone. She looked desperately at Josh and Ethan, saw the same realization dawning in their eyes. They couldn't outrun the thing, not with Olivia injured, and they couldn't leave her behind. But there was no time for debate, no time for tearful goodbyes or noble sacrifices. The thing was almost upon them, its fetid stench filling the air, its keening wail vibrating in Mia's bones. She made the only choice she could. She bent down, grabbed Olivia under the arms, and started dragging her backwards, away from the approaching horror. It was awkward, clumsy, Olivia's dead weight threatening to topple Mia at every step. But Mia gritted her teeth and kept going, refusing to give in to the burning in her arms, the screaming protest of her muscles. Behind her, she could hear Josh and Ethan, their voices raised in shouts of encouragement and terror. They had taken up positions on either side of the corridor, their flashlights trained on the junction, ready to buy Mia and Olivia what little time they could. And then the thing rounded the corner, and all hope died. It was even more horrifying up close, its bloated, misshapen body glistening with slime, its distorted face split in that terrible grin. It paused for a moment, its eyeless gaze sweeping over them, and Mia knew with a sick, sinking certainty that it was savoring their fear, reveling in their despair. Then it lunged, its elongated arms reaching out to seize its prey, and the world dissolved into a chaos of screams and flailing limbs and terrible, tearing pain. Chapter 8. Mia didn't remember much of what happened next. Didn't want to remember. It came to her in flashes, in brief, gut-wrenching snippets that her mind shied away from like a hand from a hot stove. Ethan screaming as the thing's claws raked across his chest, leaving bloody furrows in their wake. Josh swinging a rusted pipe, the metal connecting with the thing's skull with a sickening crack. Olivia sobbing, dragging herself away from the melee, her broken ankle trailing behind her at a grotesque angle. And through it all, that terrible keening wail, that laughter like nails on a chalkboard, scraping at the inside of Mia's skull. Somehow, through the pain and the terror and the blood-soaked chaos, they managed to break free. Managed to stumble away down the corridor, half carrying, half dragging each other, leaving the thing writhing and thrashing on the damp stone floor behind them. They ran, blind with fear, heedless of direction or destination, knowing only that they had to get away, had to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the nightmare-made flesh that pursued them. They ran until their lungs burned and their muscles screamed in protest, until the adrenaline that had sustained them drained away, leaving them weak and shaking and utterly spent. And then, just when Mia thought she couldn't take another step, just when she was sure her heart would burst from the strain, they saw it. A door set into the stone wall at the end of the corridor, a way out. Mia nearly wept with relief. She staggered forward, Olivia leaning heavily against her, and grasped the handle with a trembling hand. It was locked. Of course it was locked. The asylum kept its secrets, held on to its prey with jealous, spiteful glee. But Mia couldn't accept it, couldn't let this be the end. She threw herself at the door, again and again, screaming with rage and desperation, pounding on the unyielding metal until her fists were bruised and bloody. And then, miraculously, the lock gave way. The door swung open with a groan of rusted hinges, and Mia nearly tumbled through, dragging Olivia with her. They found themselves in a small, dimly lit room, the walls lined with shelves bearing dusty specimen jars and moldering medical texts. An examination table stood in the center of the room, its leather straps hanging loose and stained with ancient rust-colored spatters. Mia barely registered any of it. Her attention was focused solely on the other door, set into the far wall. The door that led out of this nightmare back to the world of light and sanity. She lurched towards it, numb with exhaustion and spent adrenaline. Behind her she could hear the others stirring, Josh groaning as he hauled himself to his feet, Ethan hissing in pain as he pressed a hand to his bloodied chest. Mia's fingers closed around the door handle. She turned it, bracing herself for resistance, for the cruel, mocking click of another lock. But the handle turned smoothly, the door swinging open on silent, well-oiled hinges. And beyond it, darkness. Absolute, impenetrable darkness, thick and heavy as velvet. It seemed to flow into the room like a physical thing, clinging to Mia's skin, flowing into her nose and mouth, choking the scream that bubbled up in her throat. She tried to step back, to slam the door shut against this new horror. But it was too late. The darkness reached for her, enveloped her. dragged her forward into its smothering embrace. The last thing Mia heard as the darkness claimed her was the thing's laughter, echoing in the distance. Triumphant, gleeful, hungry. Chapter 9. Mia floated in darkness, a thick, viscous thing that pressed against her eyes, her mouth, her skin. It filled her lungs, her veins, seeped into the cracks and crevices of her mind. She tried to struggle, to fight her way back to the surface, back to light and air and sanity. But the darkness held her fast, dragged her down, down into its endless, inky depths. Time lost all meaning. There was only the darkness, the silence, the slow, inexorable suffocation of herself. She could feel it happening, could feel pieces of her identity, her memories, her very being flaking away, dissolving into the void. And then, just when she thought there was nothing left, just when she was sure the last flickering ember of her consciousness would gut her out, light, blinding, searing light, stabbing through the darkness like a lance. Mia squeezed her eyes shut against it, a whimper tearing itself from her raw, aching throat. Hands grasped her hard and rough, hauling her upright. Voices swirled around her, urgent, overlapping. She couldn't make out the words, couldn't understand anything beyond the pain, the disorientation, the overwhelming, dizzying rush of sensation. Someone was shaking her, fingers digging into her shoulders. Mia forced her eyes open, blinking against the glare. A face swam into focus above her, pale and strained and streaked with grime. Josh. It was Josh, his eyes wide and wild, his mouth moving as he shouted something at her. Mia shook her head, trying to clear the fog from her mind. She was lying on something hard and cold, gritty stone biting into her back. The room was awash with a harsh white light, painfully bright after the smothering darkness. "Have to go," Josh was saying, his voice finally penetrating the haze. "Mia, come on, we have to move." He dragged her to her feet and Mia swayed, her legs threatening to buckle beneath her. She looked around wildly, trying to get her bearings. They were back in the examination room, the one with the specimen jars and the ancient medical texts. The door they had come through, the one that had led to that terrible, consuming darkness, stood open, a rectangle of impenetrable black. And on the examination table in the center of the room, Mia's gorge rose, a scream building in her chest, because on the table, strapped down with those stained leather restraints, was Olivia, or rather, what was left of Olivia. Her body had been altered, twisted and reshaped like clay in the hands of a mad sculptor. Her limbs were elongated, the bones stretched to the point of snapping, the skin pulled taut and glistening. Her torso was a misshapen lump, the ribs and spine grotesquely distorted, and her face, dear God, her face. It was a ruin, a nightmarish mask of agony and horror. The eyes had been gouged out, leaving dark, gaping sockets. The mouth was a ragged, gaping maw, the jaw dislocated, the tongue lolling obscenely. Mia stumbled back, a wail building in her throat. This couldn't be real. It couldn't be happening. It was a nightmare, a hallucination, a product of the darkness that had swallowed her whole. But the pain was real. The stench of blood and fear and sickness was real. And when the thing on the table, the twisted remnants of what had once been Olivia, opened its mouth and screamed. It was a sound Mia would never forget, a primal, agonized shriek that reverberated in her bones, in her soul. She clapped her hands over her ears, as if she could block out the horror, as if she could unsee the nightmare made flesh before her. But there was no escape, no respite from the madness that had consumed her world. Ethan was there suddenly, his face a mask of shock and revulsion. He grabbed Mia's arm, his fingers biting into her flesh, dragging her towards the door. "We can't," Mia choked out, unable to tear her gaze from the abomination on the table. "Olivia, we can't leave her." "That's not Olivia," Ethan snarled, his voice cracking with horror and grief. "Not anymore." He hauled Mia forward, past the writhing, screaming thing that had once been their friend. Josh was ahead of them, wrenching open the door that led back into the asylum proper. Mia stumbled through, half blind with tears, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind her, Ethan slammed the door shut, cutting off the awful echoing screams. For a moment, they just stood there staring at each other in the murky gloom of the asylum corridor. Mia could see the same shell-shocked horror she felt reflected in their faces, the same sick, sinking realization that there was no going back, no unseeing the horrors they had witnessed. And then, from somewhere deep within the asylum came a sound, a slithering, dragging sound, accompanied by a low, guttural moan that sent icy fingers crawling up Mia's spine. It was coming. The thing that had taken Liam, that had twisted Olivia into that unspeakable abomination. It was coming for them. "Run," Josh whispered, his voice thin and strained with terror. "Run!" And they did. They ran, stumbling and tripping over their own feet, heedless of direction or destination. All that mattered was getting away, putting as much distance as possible between them and the nightmare that pursued them. They ran until their lungs burned, and their hearts felt like they would burst from their chests. They ran until they couldn't run anymore, until they collapsed in a tangle of sweat-slicked limbs and heaving sobs. And when Mia finally raised her head, finally blinked the tears from her eyes and looked around, she realized with a sinking, sickening dread that she recognized where they were. The lobby. The grand, sweeping staircase, the peeling wallpaper, the moldering portrait on the wall. They were back where they had started, back at the beginning of this nightmare journey. And standing in the center of the room, silhouetted against the murky daylight filtering through the grimy windows, was a figure. Tall and gaunt, clad in the tattered remnants of a straitjacket, its head was bowed, its face hidden in shadow. But as Mia watched, frozen with horror, it slowly raised its head. And she saw its eyes. Black and fathomless, they seemed to absorb the light, to drink in the very essence of the world around them. There was a terrible, timeless knowledge in those eyes, a dark, twisted wisdom born of centuries of pain and madness. The figure took a step forward, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette with its strings pulled taut. And when it spoke, its voice was a rasping, sepulchral whisper that filled the room, filled Mia's mind, her very soul. "Welcome home," it said. "We've been waiting for you." Chapter 10. Mia couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't tear her gaze from the nightmare figure before her. It was as if those terrible, fathomless eyes had locked onto her very essence, had ensnared her in their dark, twisted thrall. Beside her, she could hear Josh and Ethan, their breaths coming in shallow, panicked gasps. They were as trapped as she was, as helpless in the face of this unspeakable horror. The figure took another step forward, its movements jerky and unnatural. Its head twitched from side to side like an insect sizing up its prey. "You've seen it now," it rasped, its voice a grating whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "The truth of this place, the darkness that lurks beneath." Mia shook her head, a whimper building in her throat. She didn't want to hear this, didn't want to know. She wanted to run, to hide, to wake up from this never-ending nightmare. But the figure continued, relentless. "For years we suffered, endured, the pain, the torment, the endless screaming madness. They thought they could contain it, control it." It laughed then, a sound like splintering bone, like shattering glass. "But the darkness cannot be contained, cannot be controlled. It is patient, hungry, and it always finds a way." Mia felt a cold, creeping dread slither up her spine. The files they had found, the records of the unspeakable experiments, the horrors inflicted on the asylum's patients. Had it all been leading to this? To some final terrifying apotheosis of all that suffering, all that madness? The figure seemed to sense her thoughts, its lipless mouth stretching into a ghastly parody of a smile. "And now it has found you, called you here to this place of pain and despair, to claim you, to make you one with the darkness." It raised a hand, the fingers gnarled and twisted like old roots. "Come," it whispered. "Come and join us. Become what you were always meant to be." And Mia felt it then. A tug, a pull, like a fishhook sunk deep into her very soul. She could feel the darkness reaching for her, cold and seductive, whispering promises of oblivion, of release from the pain and terror of the waking world. It would be so easy, she realized dimly. So easy to just let go, to surrender to that siren call, to let the darkness take her, consume her, make her one with its endless screaming void. No! The cry tore itself from Josh's throat, raw and desperate. He lurched forward, putting himself between Mia and the nightmare figure. You can't have her! You can't have any of us! The figure tilted its head, a gesture of mild, almost amused curiosity. And who are you to defy the will of the darkness? It asked, its voice a mocking rasp. Josh drew himself up, his fists clenched, his jaw set. For a moment he looked almost heroic, a defiant figure standing against the encroaching tide of madness and despair. We are more than this place, he said, his voice ringing with a conviction Mia hadn't heard before. More than the suffering it has caused. And we will not let it define us, will not let it consume us. He turned to Mia then, his eyes blazing with a desperate, feverish intensity. Mia, listen to me. This place, this thing, it only has power over us if we let it, if we give in to the fear, the despair. He grasped her hand, his fingers hot and slick with sweat. But we're stronger than that, stronger than the darkness. We can fight it, Mia. We can win. And looking into his eyes, seeing the fire there, the unshakable belief, Mia felt something kindle inside her. A spark, small and fragile, but growing stronger with each passing moment. Hope. She turned back to the figure, meeting those terrible, fathomless eyes without flinching. He's right, she said, her voice steady despite the fear, the sickness roiling in her gut. We won't be your puppets, your playthings. We are leaving this place, and we are never coming back. For a moment the figure just stared at them, its head cocked to one side like a curious bird. Then it smiled, a slow, terrible unpeeling of its lips. So be it, it whispered. But know this, the darkness is patient. It is hungry, and it will never, ever let you go. With that, it began to change. Its form seemed to ripple, to waver like a reflection in a pond disturbed by a sudden wind. The tattered straitjacket melted away, the gaunt, twisted limbs elongating, reshaping themselves into something new, something unspeakable. Mia watched in horror as the figure's face split open, the skull unfolding like some obscene flower. Jagged teeth glinted in the murky light, a long black tongue lolling obscenely. The thing that had once been human, once been a patient suffering untold torments in this hellish place, let out a shriek that seemed to rend the very air, to shatter the last remnants of sanity and reason. And then it lunged, its jaws gaping wide, its claws outstretched to rend and tear. Mia screamed, throwing herself backwards, her mind a white-hot blank of terror. She waited for the pain, for the feeling of those terrible teeth sinking into her flesh, tearing her apart. But it never came. Instead, there was a deafening bang, a flash of light so bright it seared Mia's retinas. The creature let out a high, keening wail, staggering back, dark ichor spurting from a gaping wound in its chest. Mia blinked, her vision clearing enough to see Ethan, standing tall and resolute, a smoking gun clasped in his shaking hands. I told you, he said, his voice raw and ragged. We're leaving. The creature snarled, a sound of pure, unadulterated rage. It crouched, muscles coiling beneath its mottled hide, preparing to spring. But Ethan was faster. He fired again and again, the shots echoing like thunder in the close confines of the lobby. Each bullet found its mark, tearing through rotting flesh and bone, sending the creature reeling. It let out one final agonized shriek, a sound that seemed to carry with it all the pain, all the suffering this place had ever known. And then it collapsed, its body jerking and twitching as the life drained from it in slow, sluggish pulses. For a long moment, no one moved. They just stood there, staring at the twisted, unmoving form on the floor, hardly daring to breathe. It was Josh who broke the silence, his voice thin and strained. Is it dead? Ethan lowered the gun, his hands trembling. I don't know, he admitted, but I'm not waiting around to find out. He turned to the others, his eyes hard and haunted in the gloomy half-light. We need to go. Now. Mia nodded, tearing her gaze away from the nightmare sprawled at her feet. She didn't know if it was really over, if the darkness that lurked at the heart of this place could ever truly be defeated. But she did know one thing. They had survived. Against all odds, all reason, they had stared into the face of madness and despair, and they had not blinked. And as they stumbled towards the door, towards the light and the sanity of the world outside, Mia felt a grim, inexplicable smile tug at her bloodied lips. They had won. For now, at least, they had won. Chapter 11. The sun had never seemed so bright, the air never so sweet. As Mia stumbled out of the asylum, Josh and Ethan close on her heels, she felt like a diver surfacing from the crushing depths, her lungs aching as they filled with the first clean breath in an eternity. They half ran, half staggered across the weed-choked lawn, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the squatting, malevolent bulk of Blackwood Asylum. Mia didn't dare look back, didn't dare contemplate the horrors they had left behind. It seemed unreal now, a nightmare already fading in the cold light of day. The twisting corridors, the echoing screams, the terrible, unspeakable things they had seen. Had it all really happened? Or had it been some shared delusion, some mass hysteria born of fear and darkness and the oppressive weight of the asylum's grim history? But the blood and filth caking her skin was real. The deep, throbbing ache in every muscle, every bone was real. And the haunted, hollow look in Josh and Ethan's eyes, that was the most real thing of all. They reached the car, Mia fumbling with numb, blood-slick fingers to wrench open the door. She half fell into the driver's seat, her breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. In the rearview mirror, her own face stared back at her, pale and strained and streaked with grime. For a moment, she didn't recognize herself, didn't know the wild, hunted creature looking out from behind her eyes. Ethan slid into the passenger seat, Josh clambering into the back. For a moment, they just sat there, the silence broken only by their labored breathing and the distant, mournful cries of birds. It was Josh who spoke first, his voice thin and strained. "What do we do now?" Mia shook her head, trying to clear the fog from her mind. What did they do? Go to the police, babbling about monsters and murder and impossible, unspeakable things? Check themselves into the nearest psychiatric ward, to be pumped full of pills and platitudes until the memories faded, the nightmares lost their sting? Or did they just go on, try to pick up the tattered threads of their lives, knowing what they knew, having seen what they had seen? Could they ever really go back to normal after an experience like this? She didn't know, didn't have any answers. All she knew was that they had to get away, as far and as fast as possible. She turned the key in the ignition, the engine sputtering to life. The car lurched forward, tires spinning on the gravel, before finally finding traction. They tore out of the parking lot, the asylum receding in the rearview mirror until it was nothing more than a dark smudge on the horizon, a blot of shadow against the bright blue sky. No one spoke as they drove, the miles falling away beneath their wheels. What was there to say? What words could possibly encompass the horror, the madness, the sheer mind-rending wrongness of what they had experienced? They drove until the sun began to set, until exhaustion began to tug at their eyelids, their minds. Only then did Mia pull over, guiding the car to a stop at the side of a lonely, dusty road. She turned to the others, seeing her own weariness, her own haunted desperation mirrored in their faces. "We should try to get some rest," she said, her voice sounding strange and hollow to her own ears. "Take turns driving. Put as much distance between us and that place as we can." Josh and Ethan nodded, too drained, too shell-shocked to argue. They reclined their seats, trying to find some semblance of comfort, of rest. But as Mia sat there, staring out into the gathering darkness, she knew that true rest, true peace, would be a long time coming, if it ever came at all, because every time she closed her eyes, she saw it. The asylum, the darkness, the twisted, leering faces of the things they had encountered, the horrors they had barely escaped, and worst of all, the knowledge, cold and implacable as a surgeon's blade, that it wasn't over, that the nightmare they had stumbled into was only just beginning. The darkness had touched them, had sunk its claws deep into their souls, and it would never, ever let them go. Chapter 12. Sleep did not come easy. When it did come, it was in fitful snatches, brief moments of respite in a sea of gnawing unease. Mia's mind, exhausted though it was, could not seem to let go of the horrors it had witnessed. They played behind her eyelids like a looping nightmare, a montage of suffering and madness and unspeakable things. She saw Liam's face, twisted and distorted, a grotesque mask of agony. She saw Olivia, strapped to that bloody table, her body warped beyond all recognition. She saw the endless echoing corridors of the asylum, each shadow, each flicker of movement holding some new, unimaginable horror. And through it all, permeating every moment, every thought, was the memory of those eyes. Those terrible, fathomless eyes drinking in her fear, her despair, her very essence. "You can't escape," they seemed to say. "You belong to us now, to the darkness." Mia awoke with a start. A scream lodged in her throat. For a moment, she didn't know where she was, the vestiges of the nightmare still clinging to her like cobwebs. Then the reality of her surroundings came crashing back. The cramped confines of the car, the steady rumble of tires on asphalt, the pale, strained faces of Josh and Ethan in the dim light. She sat up, rubbing at her gritty, aching eyes. Outside, the world was a blur of shadow and motion, the headlights of passing cars streaking by like shooting stars. How long had she been asleep? How far had they driven? As if sensing her unspoken question, Ethan glanced over from the driver's seat. "We're just outside of Millfield," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "Figured we could stop there for a bit, try to get our bearings." Mia nodded, the name sparking a dim flicker of recognition. Millfield, a small town, the kind of place people pass through on their way to somewhere else, the kind of place where nothing much ever happened. But then, hadn't that been what they'd thought about Blackwood Asylum? Just another abandoned ruin, a relic of a darker past. And look how that had turned out. As if on cue, Josh stirred in the back seat, a low moan escaping his lips. Mia turned to look at him, her heart clenching at the sight of his ashen, sweat-slick face. "Josh?" she said softly, reaching out to touch his shoulder. "Are you okay?" His eyes fluttered open, glassy and unfocused. For a moment he just stared at her, as if trying to remember who she was, where he was. Then, with a shuddering breath, he seemed to come back to himself. "Yeah," he mumbled, pushing himself upright. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just a bad dream." But the haunted look in his eyes, the tremor in his voice, told a different story. Mia knew because she felt it too, the lingering terror, the creeping sense of unreality, as if the nightmare hadn't ended with their escape from the asylum, as if it had followed them, burrowing deep into their minds, their very souls. Ethan guided the car off the highway, following the faded signs towards Millfield's town center. The streets were deserted at this late hour, the storefronts dark and shuttered. It was as if the whole place was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. They found a motel on the outskirts of town, a run-down two-story affair with a flickering neon sign proclaiming vacancies. Ethan parked the car, the engine ticking as it cooled in the chill night air. For a long moment no one moved. They just sat there staring out at the motel, each lost in their own dark thoughts. It was Josh who finally broke the silence, his voice thin and strained. "We should probably get some rest," he said. "Try to figure out our next move in the morning." Mia nodded, the exhaustion settling over her like a leaden blanket. Rest. Yes, that was what they needed. A few hours of oblivion, a respite from the ceaseless churning of their traumatized minds. They grabbed their few belongings and made their way to the motel office, a cramped, dingy space that smelled of stale cigarettes and mildew. The clerk, a bored-looking middle-aged man, barely glanced up from his magazine as he handed over the keys. Their room was on the second floor, at the end of a long, dimly lit hallway. Mia couldn't shake the feeling of being watched as they walked, the sensation of unseen eyes tracking their every move. "It's just your imagination," she told herself firmly. "Just your mind, playing tricks on you after everything you've been through." But the feeling persisted, a creeping unease that set her nerves jangling like live wires. By the time they reached their room, her heart was pounding, her palms slick with sweat. Ethan unlocked the door, the hinges creaking as it swung inward. The room beyond was small and sparse, with 2 sagging beds, a battered dresser, and a tiny bathroom. But it was clean, and blessedly free of the oppressive aura of decay and despair that had permeated every inch of Blackwood. Mia sank down on the edge of one of the beds, suddenly feeling as if she could sleep for 1,000 years. Josh and Ethan followed suit, their movements slow and heavy with fatigue. For a while they just sat there in silence, each grappling with the enormity of what they had experienced. It was Ethan who finally spoke, his voice low and strained. "What are we going to do?" he asked, staring down at his hands. "We can't just go back to our lives, pretend like none of this ever happened." Mia shook her head, the very thought making her stomach churn. "No," she agreed. "We can't. But I don't know what else we can do. Go to the police? Tell them what exactly? That we were attacked by monsters in an abandoned asylum?" She laughed, a short, bitter sound. "They'd think we were crazy. Hell, I'm starting to think we are crazy." "We're not crazy," Josh said, but there was a hollowness to his words, a lack of conviction. "What happened to us? It was real. Those things, whatever they were real." He looked up, his eyes haunted. "And they're still out there. The asylum, the darkness. It's not over. We may have escaped, but we haven't beaten it. Not by a long shot." A heavy silence descended, each of them grappling with the grim truth of Josh's words. They had survived their ordeal at Blackwood, but at what cost? What pieces of themselves had they left behind in those dark, twisted halls? What scars, both physical and mental, would they carry with them for the rest of their lives? Mia didn't have the answers. None of them did. All they could do was try to hold on to each other, to cling to the fragile bonds of shared trauma and survival, and pray that the darkness, the insatiable hunger of Blackwood Asylum, never found them again. Chapter 13. Morning came, gray and cheerless. Mia awoke from a restless sleep, her mind still fogged with the remnants of half-remembered nightmares. For a moment she just lay there, staring up at the water-stained ceiling, trying to gather the tattered shreds of her thoughts. Beside her, Josh and Ethan were stirring, their faces drawn and haggard in the wan light filtering through the grimy window. They looked as exhausted as Mia felt, as if the night had been a long, unending battle against the demons of their own minds. They went through the motions of mourning in silence, splashing cold water on their faces, trying to scrub away the lingering touch of the asylum's corruption. But it was a futile effort, Mia knew. Some stains, some scars, went too deep to ever be fully erased. They regrouped in the room, picking at the stale donuts and weak coffee Ethan had scavenged from the motel's meager continental breakfast. No one seemed to have much of an appetite, the events of the previous day still sitting heavy in their guts. It was Josh who finally broached the subject they'd all been avoiding, his voice low and strained. "So, what now?" he asked, staring down into his coffee cup as if it held the answers. "What do we do?" Mia shook her head, feeling the weight of hopelessness pressing down on her like a physical force. What could they do? They were just 3 traumatized college students, shattered by an experience beyond the scope of human understanding. They had no proof of what they'd seen, no way to make anyone believe the impossible horrors they'd encountered. "I don't know," she said, her voice sounding small and lost to her own ears. I don't know." Ethan leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "We need to go back," he said, his voice tight with determination. "Back to the asylum." Mia's head snapped up, her eyes widening in shock. "What?" she sputtered. "Are you insane? After everything that happened, everything we saw. You want to go back?" Ethan met her gaze, his jaw set. "We have to," he said. "We have to understand what happened to us, what that place is. It's the only way we'll ever have a chance of moving on, of getting our lives back." "Our lives?" Josh's laugh was sharp and brittle. "What lives, Ethan? You think we can just go back to normal after this? Pretend like we didn't see our friends twisted into... He broke off, his voice cracking. Mia reached out, laying a hand on his arm, feeling the tremors that ran through his body. "Josh is right," she said softly. "We can't go back. Not to the asylum, not to our old lives. We have to find a way to move forward, to deal with this on our own terms." Ethan opened his mouth to argue, but Mia cut him off, her voice growing stronger, more resolute. "We need to get away from here," she said. "Away from Millfield, away from Blackwood. Somewhere we can clear our heads, try to make sense of all this." She took a deep breath, feeling a flicker of something like hope kindling in her chest. It was a fragile thing, a tiny spark in the overwhelming darkness, but it was something to cling to, a lifeline in the churning sea of despair. "I have a cousin," she said. "She lives out in the country a few hours from here. We could go there just for a little while, get our bearings, figure out our next move." Josh and Ethan exchanged a glance, a silent communication passing between them. Then, slowly, they nodded. "Okay," Ethan said, his voice heavy with resignation. "We'll try it your way, Mia. But if this doesn't work, if we can't find a way to deal with this, I'm going back to Blackwood, with or without you." Mia swallowed hard, the flicker of hope guttering in the face of Ethan's grim determination. She knew he meant it, knew that the asylum's dark pull had sunk its claws deep into his psyche. But she also knew that going back would be a mistake, a one-way ticket to madness and oblivion. They had to find another way, had to cling to the fragile threads of their humanity, their sanity, even if it meant leaving the answers and the horror of Blackwood Asylum behind forever. Chapter 14. The drive to Mia's cousin's place was a long one, the miles stretching out in an endless ribbon of asphalt and faded road signs. They drove in silence, each lost in their own dark thoughts, their own private hells. Mia tried to focus on the road, on the monotonous task of driving, but her mind kept drifting back to the asylum, to the unspeakable things they had witnessed within its crumbling walls. She could still hear the screams, could still see the twisted, leering faces of the creatures that had once been human, and beneath it all, like a pulsing undercurrent of dread, was the knowledge that it wasn't over, that the darkness of Blackwood had marked them, had claimed them as its own. They could run, they could hide, but they would never truly be free of its taint. It was late afternoon by the time they reached their destination, a small, run-down farmhouse nestled in the heart of the countryside. Mia's cousin Sarah was waiting for them on the porch, a look of concern etched onto her freckled face. "Mia," she said, hurrying down the steps to embrace her, "I'm so glad you're here. When you called, you sounded... I was worried." Mia returned the hug, feeling a rush of gratitude for her cousin's unwavering support. Sarah had always been there for her, a constant source of love and understanding in a world that often felt cold and unforgiving. "I'm sorry for just dropping in like this," Mia said, stepping back. We needed to get away for a bit, clear our heads." Sarah nodded, her gaze flicking over to Josh and Ethan. "Of course," she said. "You're always welcome here, you know that. All of you." She led them inside, the screen door banging shut behind them. The house was small and cluttered, every surface piled high with books and knickknacks, but it felt warm and inviting, a world away from the cold, oppressive darkness of the asylum. Sarah bustled around, making up beds and putting on a pot of coffee, her chatter filling the silence. Mia let it wash over her, feeling some of the tension draining from her body. Here, in the cozy confines of her cousin's home, the horrors of Blackwood felt distant, unreal, like a nightmare fading in the light of day. But as the hours ticked by, as darkness fell over the quiet countryside, Mia could feel the unease creeping back in, the icy fingers of dread plucking at her nerves. She tossed and turned in the narrow bed, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching her from the shadows, something hungry and malevolent. Beside her, Josh and Ethan slept fitfully, their faces twisted in silent grimaces of fear and pain. Mia knew they were dreaming of the asylum, of the unspeakable things they had seen and experienced. She wished she could offer them comfort, could chase away the nightmares with soothing words and gentle touches. But the truth was she was just as lost, just as haunted. The scars Blackwood had left on their souls were too deep, too jagged to ever fully heal. Sometime in the dead of night, Mia must have finally drifted off, her exhaustion overwhelming her fear. She awoke with a start, her heart pounding, the echo of a scream still ringing in her ears. At first she thought it had been her own voice, torn from her throat by the terror of some half-remembered nightmare. But then she heard it again, a high, keening wail that sent shivers racing down her spine. It was coming from outside, from the dark, still woods that bordered the farmhouse. Mia scrambled out of bed, her body moving on autopilot, driven by some primal instinct she couldn't name. Josh and Ethan were awake too, their faces pale and strained in the moonlight filtering through the curtains. Without a word, they followed Mia out of the room, down the creaking stairs, and out into the chill night air. The scream came again, louder now, more insistent. It seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing through the trees like a ghostly siren song. Mia's feet carried her forward, her heart hammering against her ribs. She knew, with a sick, sinking certainty, what they would find. Knew that the nightmare of Blackwood had followed them, had sunk its claws into this quiet, peaceful place. And as they broke through the tree line, as the source of the screams came into view, Mia felt the last, fragile threads of her sanity begin to unravel. Because there, in the center of the clearing, was Sarah, or rather what was left of Sarah. Her body had been torn apart, ripped and shredded like a rag doll in the jaws of some savage beast. Blood pooled around her in a dark, glistening lake, soaking into the earth, staining it black. And crouched over her, their faces obscene masks of hunger and glee, were the creatures from the asylum. The twisted, malformed things that had once been human, now reduced to mindless, ravening beasts. They looked up as Mia and the others stumbled into the clearing, their eyes glinting with a feral, predatory light. And in that moment, Mia knew that there would be no escape, no respite from the horror that had consumed their lives. The darkness had found them, and it would never ever let them go. Chapter 15. Mia couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't tear her gaze away from the nightmare unfolding before her. Sarah, her beloved cousin, the person who had always been her rock, her safe harbor, reduced to a broken, bloody husk, a testament to the savagery of the creatures that now turned their attention to the three survivors. Beside her, Josh and Ethan were frozen, their faces masks of horror and disbelief. Mia could feel the scream building in her throat, the primal animal urge to flee, to run until her lungs burned and her legs gave out. But there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The monsters had found them, had tracked them across the miles like bloodhounds on a scent. And now, in this quiet, secluded glade, they would finish what they had started at Blackwood. They would rend and tear and feast, until there was nothing left but blood and bone and echoes of agonized screams. The creatures began to move, slowly at first, then with increasing speed and purpose. They loped towards the three survivors, their twisted limbs propelling them forward with a sick, unnatural grace. Their eyes glinted with a feral, hungry light, their jaws dripping with Sarah's blood. Mia felt a hand close around her arm, yanking her backwards. It was Ethan, his face set in a mask of grim determination. "Run!" he hissed, his voice tight with fear and urgency. "We have to run now!" And then they were moving, crashing through the undergrowth, thorns and branches tearing at their skin and clothes. Behind them, Mia could hear the creatures giving chase, their rasping breaths and eager snarls drawing closer with every passing second. They burst out of the tree line and into the open field beyond, the tall grass whipping at their legs as they ran. Mia's lungs burned, her heart slamming against her ribs like a caged bird. Beside her, Josh and Ethan were gasping for breath, their faces slick with sweat and terror. But the monsters were faster, their warped bodies adapted perfectly to the hunt. They closed the distance with terrifying speed, their claws reaching out to snag and tear at their prey. Mia felt a white-hot lance of pain as talons raked across her back, shredding through her shirt and into the soft flesh beneath. She stumbled, nearly falling, but Ethan's hand was there, hauling her upright, dragging her onwards. They were nearing the farmhouse now, the weathered building looming out of the darkness like a beacon of desperate hope. If they could just reach it, just get inside and bar the doors. But it was too late. The creatures were upon them, a writhing mass of teeth and claws and nightmare-made flesh. They slammed into the survivors from behind, sending them tumbling to the ground in a tangle of flailing limbs and terrified screams. Mia felt the breath driven from her lungs as she hit the dirt, stars exploding across her vision. She rolled onto her back, gasping, only to find herself staring up into the face of one of the monsters. Its features were a grotesque parody of humanity, the skin stretched tight over misshapen bones, the eyes nothing but black, soulless pits. Its jaws gaped open, revealing rows of jagged, razor-sharp teeth, still stained with Sarah's blood. Mia screamed, a raw, animal sound of pure terror. She scrabbled backwards, kicking out with her legs, trying desperately to put some distance between herself and the looming horror. But the creature was too fast, too strong. It pounced on her, pinning her to the ground with its twisted, powerful limbs. Mia could feel its hot, fetid breath on her face, could smell the reek of blood and decay that emanated from its body. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing herself for the agony of tearing flesh and snapping bone. But the pain never came. Instead, there was a loud, resounding crack, like a tree branch snapping in a storm. The creature let out a high, keening wail, its weight suddenly lifting from Mia's body. She opened her eyes, blinking away tears of fear and confusion. Ethan was standing over her, a large, jagged rock clutched in his white-knuckled hands. The creature lay a few feet away, its skull caved in, dark blood oozing from the gaping wound. Ethan reached down, hauling Mia to her feet. His face was spattered with blood, his eyes wild and haunted. "Come on," he rasped, his voice raw and shaking. "We have to keep moving." Mia looked around wildly, her heart lodging in her throat. Josh was a few yards away, grappling with another of the creatures. He had a length of rusty chain wrapped around its throat, the links biting deep into the mottled flesh as he strained to choke the life from the thrashing monster. The third creature was nowhere to be seen, but Mia could hear it, crashing through the undergrowth at the edge of the field, circling around to cut off their escape. "The house!" she panted, grabbing Ethan's arm. "We have to get to the house!" Together they staggered towards the looming structure, half dragging, half carrying each other. Behind them, Mia heard Josh cry out in pain and anger, the sounds of his struggle growing fainter as they limped onwards. They reached the porch steps, Mia nearly collapsing as her legs threatened to give out beneath her. Ethan shouldered open the front door, the hinges shrieking in protest. They stumbled over the threshold, into the dark, yawning mouth of the house. Mia slammed the door shut behind them, fumbling with the bolt with shaking, blood-slicked fingers. For a moment they just stood there, chests heaving, hearts pounding. The silence of the house pressed down on them like a physical weight, broken only by their ragged breathing and the distant, muffled sounds of the creatures outside. Then, from somewhere deep within the bowels of the farmhouse, they heard it. A sound that turned Mia's blood to ice in her veins, that sent a fresh wave of nauseating terror crashing over her. Laughter. High, manic, utterly unhinged laughter, echoing up from the basement like the cackle of some demented, unseen jester. And beneath it, woven through the peals of insane mirth like a dark, pulsing undercurrent, the wet, meaty sounds of tearing flesh and snapping bone. Oh God, the creatures weren't just outside. They were inside too, inside the house, and they were no longer alone. Chapter 16. Mia's mind reeled, trying to process the new horror that had been thrust upon them. The creatures were in the house, the one place they thought they might be safe, might be able to catch their breath and regroup, and it was infested with the same nightmarish monstrosities that had pursued them so relentlessly. Beside her, Ethan was shaking, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. He looked at Mia, his eyes wide and haunted in the gloom. "What do we do?" he whispered, his voice cracking with strain and terror. "Where do we go?" Mia shook her head, feeling the hopelessness, the utter despair crashing over her in suffocating waves. There was nowhere to go, nowhere to run. They were trapped. caught between the horrors outside and the unspeakable things that lurked within. The laughter came again, louder now, more manic. It was coming from the basement, from the dark, dank depths that Mia had always avoided as a child, too frightened of the shadows and the scuttling, unseen things that seemed to dwell there. Now it seemed those childhood fears had been all too warranted. There was something down there, something that giggled and cackled with a mad, unholy glee as it... Mia wrenched her mind away from the thought, unable to bear the images that rose like bile in her throat. She couldn't think about what might be happening to Josh, about the wet, tearing sounds that underscored that terrible laughter. If she did, she might just lose her tenuous grip on sanity altogether. Ethan was moving now, edging towards the kitchen, his movements stiff and jerky with fear. Mia followed, feeling as though she were in a dream, a nightmare from which she might never wake. Ethan was rummaging through the drawers, his hands shaking so badly he could barely grip the handles. He pulled out a large, wicked-looking knife, the blade glinting dully in the faint light spilling from the living room windows. "Here," he said, thrusting a second knife into Mia's hands. "Just in case." He trailed off, unable to give voice to the unspeakable possibilities that loomed before them. Mia took the knife, feeling the weight of it in her palm, the cold bite of the metal against her skin. A weapon. As if any mere blade could stand against the horrors that had invaded this house, this sanctuary. As if anything could save them now from the nightmare that had consumed their lives. The laughter had stopped now, replaced by a silence that was somehow even more terrifying. Mia strained her ears, trying to pick out any sound, any hint of movement from the basement. But there was nothing. Just a thick, heavy silence, pressing down on them like a smothering blanket. Mia could feel the panic rising in her chest, the urge to scream, to run, to do something, anything, to break this awful, ominous quiet. And then, from the depths of the house, came a new sound. A slow, shuffling tread, the creak of floorboards under a heavy, lumbering weight. Footsteps, coming up from the basement, coming towards them. Mia's grip tightened on the knife, her knuckles turning white. Beside her, Ethan had gone rigid, his breath coming in short, sharp pants. The footsteps grew louder, closer. They seemed to fill the house, echoing off the walls, vibrating through the floor. Mia could feel them in her bones, in her very soul. And then, the basement door swung open. Slowly, with a long, drawn-out creak that set Mia's teeth on edge. A figure stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the blackness behind it, tall and hulking, with broad, misshapen shoulders and long, dangling arms that ended in wickedly curved claws. But it was the head that drew Mia's gaze, that sent a fresh wave of mind-numbing terror crashing over her. Because perched atop those massive shoulders, leering down at them with a mad, malevolent glee, was Josh's face, or rather what was left of it. The flesh had been ripped and torn, peeled back from the bone in ragged, glistening strips. One eye dangled from its socket on a glistening thread of optic nerve, the other nothing but a raw red hole. The jaw had been wrenched open, the tongue ripped out, leaving nothing but a gaping, blood-drenched maw. And worst of all, impossibly, horrifyingly, the face was still alive. Still moving, still twitching with a sick, puppet-like parody of life. The thing that had been Josh, the creature that now wore his face like a grotesque, ill-fitting mask, opened that terrible, yawning mouth. And from the depths of its throat, in a voice that was a guttural, rasping mockery of their friends, it spoke, "Welcome home, Mia. We've been waiting for you." Chapter 17. Mia couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't tear her gaze away from the abomination that stood before them. It was Josh, but it wasn't. Not anymore. Whatever had been left of their friend, of the boy they had known and loved, had been consumed, devoured by the darkness that now wore his face like a trophy. Beside her, Ethan made a sound, a low animal moan of horror and grief. The creature's head swiveled towards him, the dangling eye fixing on him with a sort of vicious, predatory glee. "Don't be shy, Ethan," it rasped, the words wet and thick, bubbling up from its ruined throat. There's plenty of me to go around." It took a step forward, the floorboards creaking under its weight. Mia could smell it now, the reek of blood and decay, of rot and corruption. It filled her nostrils, her lungs seemed to seep into her very pores. Ethan was backing away, the knife trembling in his white-knuckled grip. "Stay back," he warned, his voice shaking. "Don't come any closer or I'll—" "You'll what?" the creature mocked. "Stab me? Cut me? As if your pitiful weapons could harm me now." It laughed, a wet, gurgling sound that made Mia's stomach heave. "I am beyond pain, beyond death. I am the darkness made flesh, the hunger that devours all. And you are mine." It lunged then, with a speed that belied its hulking, misshapen form. Ethan screamed, bringing the knife up in a futile attempt to ward off the attack. But the creature batted the blade aside as if it were nothing, its claws closing around Ethan's throat, lifting him off his feet as if he weighed no more than a child. Mia watched in horror as Ethan kicked and thrashed, his face turning purple as he struggled for air. The creature brought him close, its ruined face inches from his own. "Shh," it whispered, a grotesque parody of comfort. "Don't fight it. It'll all be over soon." Its jaws opened wide, wider than any human mouth could go. Ethan's screams took on a new, frantic pitch as he saw his death yawning before him. Mia didn't think, didn't hesitate. She acted on pure instinct, a primal, desperate need to save her friend, to stop this horror before it could claim another victim. She charged forward, the knife raised high. With a scream of rage and despair, she brought the blade down, plunging it deep into the creature's back, between its broad, misshapen shoulder blades. The thing howled, dropping Ethan as it spun to face its attacker. Mia stumbled back, the knife slipping from her grasp, slick with dark, oily blood. The creature glared at her, the hate, the hunger in its eyes beyond anything human, anything sane. It reached back, its claws closing around the hilt of the knife, wrenching it free with a sickening, wet sound. "Foolish girl," it hissed, tossing the blade aside. "Do you think you can hurt me? Do you think you can stop what's coming?" It advanced on her, its twisted, lumbering gait carrying it forward with terrible, inexorable purpose. Mia scrambled backwards, her heart slamming against her ribs, her mind a whirling blank of terror. She felt her back hit the wall, felt the cold, unyielding surface pressing against her spine. There was nowhere left to run, nowhere to hide. The creature loomed over her, its bulk blocking out the light, filling her world with its shadow. It reached for her, its claws poised to rend and tear. Mia squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the agony, the oblivion that awaited. And in that moment, in the heartbeat before the end, a strange sort of calm washed over her. This was it, the final moment. The darkness had won, had claimed its final victory. And there was a part of her, a small, secret part, that welcomed it, that yearned for the release, the escape that only death could bring. But then, in the depths of her despair, in the heart of the shadows that engulfed her, she heard it. A voice, distant and echoing, as if from the bottom of a deep, deep well. "Mia! Mia, wake up! It's just a dream, just a nightmare. Come back to us, Mia, come back!" The creature froze, its claws inches from her face. It cocked its head, as if listening to something only it could hear. And then, impossibly, miraculously, it began to fade. Its form wavered, grew translucent, as if it were nothing more than smoke on the wind. The darkness receded, drawing back like a tide. Light bloomed, chasing away the shadows, banishing the horror that had threatened to consume her. Mia blinked, her eyes adjusting to the sudden, blinding brightness. She was lying in a bed, crisp white sheets tangled around her legs. Josh and Ethan were there, their faces drawn and haggard, but blessedly, beautifully alive. "Mia?" Josh's voice was soft, tentative. Are you with us?" Mia sat up slowly, her mind struggling to make sense of this new reality. What happened?" she croaked, her throat raw and aching. "Where are we?" "The hospital," Ethan said gently. "You've been here for 3 days, ever since we got out of the asylum." The asylum, Blackwood. The memories came rushing back, a tidal wave of horror and despair. But they were distant now, muted, as if she were remembering a story she had heard long ago. rather than events she had lived through. "It was all a dream," Josh said, seeing the confusion, the fear in her eyes. "The farmhouse, Sarah. None of it was real. Just a nightmare, brought on by the trauma, the shock of what we went through." Mia shook her head, trying to clear the cobwebs, to separate the threads of dream from reality. It had seemed so real, so visceral. The terror, the pain, the sickening certainty of her own impending doom. But it felt so... She trailed off, unable to find the words to convey the sheer mind-rending horror of what she had experienced. Ethan laid a hand on hers, his touch warm and solid and grounding. "We know," he said softly. "Believe me, we know. We've all been there, trapped in our own personal hells." He glanced at Josh, a look of haunted understanding passing between them. "But it's over now. We're safe. We made it out." Mia wanted to believe him, wanted to let herself be comforted, to sink into the relief, the blessed normalcy of this moment. But there was a part of her, a small, insistent voice in the back of her mind that whispered otherwise. That told her that the nightmare wasn't over, that the darkness of Blackwood could never truly be escaped. She pushed the thought away, forced herself to focus on the present, on the solid, reassuring presences of her friends at her side. They had survived. They had beaten the odds, had clawed their way out of the abyss. Surely that counted for something. The doctor came then, a kind-faced woman with gentle hands and a soothing voice. She checked Mia's vitals, asked her questions, made soothing noises about rest and recovery and the resilience of the human spirit. Mia let it wash over her, let herself be lulled by the comforting routines of medical care. But even as she smiled and nodded and made all the right responses, she could feel it. A cold, creeping dread, coiling in the pit of her stomach. A certainty, bone deep and unshakable, that this was not the end. That the darkness was still out there, waiting, watching. And that someday, somehow, it would find them again. Epilogue. The sun was setting as they left the hospital, painting the sky in vivid streaks of orange and red. Mia paused on the sidewalk, tilting her face up to the fading light, letting the warmth wash over her. It felt good. Normal. Like the first tentative step on the long road back to a life that made sense. A world that followed the rules. Josh and Ethan were at her side, their shoulders brushing hers. A silent, steadying presence. They had barely left her side in the days since she'd woken, as if afraid that she might slip away again if they let her out of their sight. Mia understood. The bonds between them now went beyond friendship, beyond shared experience. They were survivors, the three of them, bound together by the unspeakable horrors they had faced, the darkness they had stared down. But even as she stood there, basking in the glow of the setting sun, in the comfort of her friend's presence, Mia could feel it. A prickling at the back of her neck, a cold, creeping sense of being watched. She turned slowly, her gaze drawn inexorably to the shadows that pooled at the edges of the parking lot, the dark, yawning mouth of the alleyway across the street. For a moment she thought she saw something move in those shadows. A flicker of motion, a deeper darkness within the dark. A shape that was almost human, but not quite. Mia blinked, and it was gone. Just a trick of the light, a phantom born of frayed nerves and too many sleepless nights. But even as she told herself that, even as she let Josh and Ethan lead her away, towards the waiting car and the promise of home, Mia knew better. The nightmare of Blackwood might be over, but the darkness, the hunger that lurked at the heart of that accursed place, that would never end. It would follow them, stalking their steps, haunting their dreams, waiting for the moment to strike, to pull them back into its crushing, ravenous embrace. And someday, Mia knew with a cold, numb certainty, it would succeed. Someday the darkness would claim them, one by one, until there was nothing left but blood and bone and fading, echoing screams. But until then, until that final fateful day, they would live. They would cling to each other, to the fragile, flickering light of hope and humanity that still burned within them. They had survived the unsurvivable. had walked through the valley of the shadow and emerged, battered and broken, but alive. And for now, for this one shining moment, that would have to be enough. The end.